The Book of Esther, Expanded Edition. In our first video on Esther, we explored the amazing story about the courage of Esther and Mordecai in the face of horrible evil. It's the only book of the Bible that doesn't mention God, not even once. But this omission is on purpose. The author is inviting the reader to look for signs of God's activity behind the scenes of the story. And here's a summary. Esther and Mordecai are Jewish exiles in the Persian capital of Susa. Esther is providentially elevated to become queen around the time that Haman tricks the king into decreeing a genocide of the Jewish people. But ironically, Haman ends up having to honor Mordecai, and then Haman is executed in the very place he was planning to kill Mordecai. After this, Haman's schemes are reversed as the king decrees that the Jewish people should defend themselves during the days called Purim. The book concludes with the Jewish people flourishing in exile as Esther and Mordecai are elevated to rule alongside the king. Now, the book of Esther was designed as part of a unified collection of scriptural scrolls, later called the Torah, Prophets, and Writings, or in Hebrew, Tanakh. The collection took shape after the exile of the Israelites to Babylon, and for generations, Jewish prophets and scholars studied these texts and produced the books that we are familiar with today, Esther among them. But this process of studying and writing continued, and some scrolls were expanded in ways that made the collection even more interconnected. This sometimes resulted in a longer edition of biblical books, and this is what happened to the book of Esther. The expanded edition of Esther in Hebrew was produced in multiple stages, sometime around the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC. It was then translated into Greek, somewhere in the 2nd to 1st centuries BC. And while this translation eventually fell out of use in Jewish circles, it became widespread among Jesus' followers in the first centuries of the Christian movement. In fact, the expanded Greek version became the standard biblical version of Esther in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox traditions, while Judaism and later Protestant Christians went with the earlier and shorter Hebrew version. So let's explore the new material in the expanded edition. But first, remember how the earlier edition of Esther was designed as an elaborate symmetry. The first half of the story leads up to the great reversal between Haman and Mordecai. And then the book's second half mirrors and reverses every matching section from the first. Now, the new material of Esther's expanded edition enhances this mirror design with a new matching prologue and then an epilogue. The prologue begins with Mordecai having a dream that previews the entire story to come. He sees a dark world of chaos with 2 roaring dragons that rouse the nations to battle. And then God's people are there crying out for deliverance, and then a tiny spring bubbles up into a great river as the sun rises and the oppressed are exalted over the wicked. Whoa. Mordecai's dream makes for a strange picture. But every one of these symbols is drawn from texts elsewhere in the scriptures. The image of 2 conflicting dragons is drawn from the story of Moses' snake staff versus the snake staffs of Pharaoh's sorcerers. This is also connected to the Exodus image of God's oppressed people crying out for help, along with the symbol of salvation at sunrise when Pharaoh's army was taken out by the waters of the sea. And that spring that becomes a river is adopted from the Garden of Eden story as it was described by the prophet Ezekiel. For him, this river is a divine source of life, bringing new creation to a world of death. Mordecai's dream is also patterned after the dreams of Joseph and Daniel. They're an invitation to the reader to discover deeper meaning in this story, to see how the downfall of Haman and the deliverance of the Jews is part of a larger cosmic drama of God's purpose to bring about a new Exodus and a new creation. This dream prologue is mirrored by a new epilogue to the book, where Mordecai, who's now exalted as a ruler, recalls and interprets his dream. He realizes that he and Haman were the 2 dragons, duking it out like Moses and Pharaoh. And Esther was both the river of life and the sunrise of God's salvation for the oppressed. So cool. The next major difference in Esther's expanded edition is found in the matching scenes where the king is writing out decrees. In chapter 3, when Haman persuaded the king to order the destruction of the Jews. In the second edition, we're actually given the text of the decree. The king justifies the annihilation of the Jewish people by claiming that their unique way of life threatens the empire's stability. It's an ironic critique of leaders who mask their greed and racism with noble-sounding words. And interestingly, the language in this decree is drawn from the speeches of Daniel's Babylonian enemies in the book of Daniel. When we turn to the corresponding story in the book's second half, we see Mordecai and Esther persuading the king to make a new decree that will reverse Haman's decree. And here again, the new edition of Esther supplies the text of the decree. The king describes Haman as arrogant and deceptive, and he uses imagery drawn from the books of Daniel and the Psalms. The Jews, on the other hand, he describes in glowing terms. The king praises the laws of the Torah with language taken right out of Deuteronomy. The last main expansion in Esther's longer edition is placed in chapter 4. It's when Mordecai and Esther learn about Haman's decree, and they mourn and fast for 3 days. Now, usually in the Bible, when people fast, they also pray for God's help. Now, in Esther's first edition, nobody was praying. But in the expanded version, everybody's praying. And once again, the language is drawn from earlier biblical stories. Mordecai's prayer sounds just like Moses' intercession on Mount Sinai in the story of the golden calf. And Esther's prayer draws from the prayers of Daniel and Nehemiah. So then, when you back up and you compare Esther's shorter and longer editions, the message of the story is still the same. But the more subtle underlying themes of the earlier edition are more explicit in the later one. These differences also give us a window into how biblical authors interpreted and connected stories and ideas from different scriptural scrolls in the final stages of the Old Testament's formation. The expanded version of Esther is more clearly woven into the unified storyline of the Tanakh collection. It's about God's purpose to raise up the seed of Abraham to overcome evil through their suffering, so that all creation can be liberated in a new Exodus. And that's what the first and second editions of Esther are all about.